Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Well, this week, as most weeks, if you turn from the domestic news pages to the foreign ones, you'll find violence and anger in the Middle East dominating page after page. Today, Israel retaliating for UN moves on recognising a Palestinian state. More awful violence in Syria, political confrontation in Egypt. So what would it be like if the entire region was also nuclear armed? Israel's got nuclear weapons and Iran is now on the very edge of getting them. I'm joined today by the human rights lawyer Geoffrey Robertson, who wants nuclear weaponry to be opposed by international law, by the veteran Liberal Democrat anti-nuclear campaigner Shirley Williams, by the neoconservative writer Douglas Murray, and by David Patrikarakos, who's written a detailed history of the bomb and Iran. And David, let's just start with you, because I think a lot of people will be surprised just how early the story of Iran's nuclear program starts.
I think you're right. I mean, it actually starts in the 1950s. So we're talking about a program that is over 60 years old now. It has deep roots in Iranian history under the last ruling regime of Iran, the Shah of Iran, the King of Iran, who desired nuclear power because he thought it would make his country very Western and very modern. He saw that his role models, Britain, his role models, America and France, all the Western powers were nuclear powers. And he thought this was the way that Iran would become modern, and this is how he would regain imperial glory, if you like.
And this is after a long period when Iran had basically been carved up or dominated by Britain and by Russia, and increasingly in this period by America. And in fact, the Americans are the first people to hand over plutonium to Tehran.
They are indeed. I mean, the nuclear program started with a bilateral agreement in 1957 between the Iranians and the Americans that gave the Iranians their first nuclear reactor, a small research reactor in Tehran. I would say, though, that from the very beginning, despite having been instrumental in giving nuclear power to Iran, America has been very, very robust on proliferation with Iran. Even when they were big allies in the 1970s, the Shah and various presidents, President Nixon, President Carter, they were adamant that Iran should not proliferate. So they have been consistent on this.
So what happened after the fall of the Shah? You have the regime of Khomeini, you have the Islamic Republic, and the first period of that is kind of pretty robustly against nuclear weapons, isn't it?
Well, that's the very interesting thing. The Shah saw a nuclear program as a very Western thing. So what he did is he dealt with Western powers. The Germans and the French were building the nuclear facilities in Iran. Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini came during the Islamic Revolution and decided there would be no, as he called it, Westoxification in Iran. This was the sullying of pure Islam by Western influence. So the nuclear program was seen as a Trojan horse for Western influence. It was seen to be in the hands of vicious foreigners, quote unquote. So it was actually scrapped initially.
Geoffrey Robertson, your book, Mullahs Without Mercy, covers some of this area too.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that the position turned when Saddam started to use chemical weapons during in the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq war, and the West just turned a blind eye to it. He killed tens of thousands of young Iranians on the battlefield, and Iran then felt, well, the only way we can beat him is by going nuclear, and that is what the Revolutionary Guards advised. And Khomeini, who had initially said nuclear weapons are un-Islamic, we won't have them, they're a Western-designed weapon, changed his mind because he got the advice that they could win the war with Saddam only if they had nuclear weapons. And from 1986, when they invited A.Q. Khan to Iran for the first time, and he was the Mr. Nuclear Weapons, and they paid him millions in the 90s. So that there is no doubt that from that point they have sought for their own security nuclear weapons.
Well, we're going to be talking about, I'm sure, the sinister Dr. Khan at some greater length later on. Shirley Williams, though, just coming...
Well, I'm glad Geoffrey said what he did, because there's a sense in which Iran is, I think, much more of a victim power than we tend to see it as being in the West. It's easy to forget that in the Iran-Iraq war, where, incidentally, they were strong arms supplies to Iraq by the West, not to Iran. The level of dying was equivalent to that of the First World War in France or Britain in terms of the proportion of the population that died. And just legion after legion of young men were flung in with no effective weapons against the Iraqis, who were a much more highly sophisticated armed country. Second thing to say about Iran, it's very important, and it really is crucial, this, in my view, I think it was a huge mistake of the United States to allow the breach of diplomatic relations that happened after the hostage crisis, and then President Carter got really angry. Well, I understand why they broke off diplomatic relations at that point. The UK's done it too. But to keep it going for something of the order of 30 years is simply crackers. And what it means is that the United States has very few contacts with Iran, very little chance to talk down the back channels, as they're sometimes called, with the really quite substantial number of Iranians who are pro-Western. It's very notable that young Iranians are more keen on the United States than any other power, far more keen on the United States than on Russia or China. So it's a country where there was a huge, I think still is a huge potential for beginning to move it into the international community, but where effectively the victimisation has been so great that there's very little inclination in Iran to move in that direction.
And yet we are very close now to the position where Iran will have nuclear weapons, and there's
I don't
something
agree with
to
that. I think that what I believe is, in effect, what David says is absolutely right. That's to say, I think Iran will go up to the threshold and stay under the threshold for quite a long time to come, if it's allowed to do so.
Well, it'll be at the threshold within a few months.
Oh, that's perfectly true.
And
I don't deny that at all.
I mean, while we're seeing it as a victim state, it is a criminal state. I mean, I think it is essential. Why I call my book Mullahs Without Mercy is that the mullahs who run it have committed international crime after international crime, crimes against humanity. They've mass murdered their own people in prison. They have killed over 160 people internationally in a global assassination campaign. They have killed over 100 and tortured many more after the Green Revolution. So these are people who massacre with impunity their own people, give them a nuclear weapon, and we are in a new era, I think.
I must say two things about that. One is that I think in your book, which incidentally I'm entirely with you, you're a brilliant human rights campaigner, but I think you have rather skipped over places like Rwanda, the Congo, Liberia and several others, which have got terrible human rights records. And secondly, very quickly, I was in Iran at the time of the Shah's coming to, when he came to power, when he was in power, and he had Savak. His behaviour was almost exactly
protested against Savak. Its tortures were not, unfortunately, as bad as those that came after.
Pretty awful.
Douglas Murray, we are pretty close. Whether it's weeks or months or however long they stay just under the nuclear threshold of Iran being able to do this. Give us your view of what the effect then is, particularly on Israel, but on the region generally.
Well, the first thing is there are obviously sort of two egg timers that have been turned over in relation to Iran. One is its seeking of nuclear power and nuclear capability and indeed a deliverable nuclear device. And the second, of course, is the longevity of the regime. And so much to do with this depends on which of those egg timers runs out first. If the regime finds itself in deep trouble, first of all, and indeed is able to be overthrown by the people, who I agree have a great pro-Western tendency, then the outcome would be one way, and I think a preferable way. If, however, the current regime in Iran manages to get to the nuclear threshold and indeed step beyond that, then really it's all open. I mean, if you like what the Iranian revolutionary government does now, you're going to love what it'll do when it's nuclear. It already, and I think too little recognised in this country, it already acts as an extraordinary destabilising force within its own region. Don't forget what it's been doing in recent years in Syria, and even in recent months. I mean, there have been people now protesting on the streets of Iran saying, why are you funding the slaughter of our brothers in Syria, and we don't have enough food here in Iran? There are all sorts of things that the Iranian revolutionary government has done since 1979 to destabilise Syria, the Lebanon, Israel and elsewhere. So, to my mind, even if you take the proliferation aspect of this off the table, the impact of Iran exercising its power as a nuclear power across the region is a terrible thought.
David Patrick Agaros, in your book Nuclear Iran, you argue that the last bit of the sort of nuclear threshold is about politics, not about technology.
Not quite. What I point out rather worryingly, is that many senior regime officials, including Hassan Rouhani, who is Iran's former chief nuclear negotiator, have said that only thing stopping Iran enriching from civil levels, about 3.5%, 20%, to weapons-grade levels, 80% or above, is a political decision. That's the difference. One thing I would point out, though, and I think Iran is very close. It's very close to threshold capability, but I think we should point out that it's actually very hard for it to step over that capability without they'd have to throw out the inspectors. I mean, this is a point that must be raised, and I've spoken to people in the White House, and if Iran threw out the inspectors, then I think America would act. And I think that you'd see action against Natanz and the enrichment sites.
Can I interrupt David for a minute? Sure. I mean, I take what you point. I've also spoken to people in the White House and the Obama administration who are extremely keen, I think, to try to get a new diplomatic discussion going. They're willing to talk bilaterally, which some previous American administrations have not. But I think one thing one has to say very loud and clear is that the American Security Service, indeed the Israeli Security Service, people like Benny Gantz, have been quite clear that an attack on Iran, of the kind that to some extent Douglas does indicate he would not find unacceptable, would be...
So far, but
you have, but I mean, you have. But it's perfectly, they say very loudly, I'm talking about the security service, not the politicians now, absolutely clear that this would drive Iran into a much more massive attempt to cross that threshold, and incidentally also add to that they believe, I mean, I'll use Michael Hayden, who was the main advisor to George W. Bush, who said to George Bush towards the end of his administration that to attack Iran would be a great mistake. It would tend to create the very situation we're scared of.
I want to come on to what can be done a little bit later on, if we don't mind. I'd like to turn now to what happens to the rest of the region. In nuclear terms, if Iran does cross that threshold. Let's assume for the sake of argument that it does, or is perceived to be about to. What happens to the other countries? You know that Israel's got around 200
Israel,
nuclear...
of course, has a policy of nuclear opacity, which is in effect nuclear hypocrisy. We know that they've got at least 80 nukes, some of them on submarines stooging in the Mediterranean, and they can hit Tehran. What happens next?
Just to finish on the submarines, the point is that if Iran attacked Israel with nuclear weapons, then there's a sort of Armageddon after the event reprisal coming back.
I'm sure the letter of last resort signed by Mr. Netanyahu would be that they must loose their Dolphin-class missiles on Tehran.
That's Israel. But what about
that will keep a nuclear-armed Tehran from, I think, attacking Israel. However, they're more likely, in my view, to attack Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is already negotiating with Pakistan to buy some off-the-peg Sunni Muslim bombs. Egypt, of course, is now under the Muslim Brotherhood, which a few years ago said Egypt must have a nuclear weapon. Indeed, they opposed Mubarak's policy of a nuclear-free Middle East. We've just had the spectacle of the United Nations and the disarmament people cancelling their December conference in Finland for a nuclear-free Middle East, because, of course, that is an absurdity, unfortunately. We have a nuclear-full Middle East, or we will in a few years' time, if Iran makes the decision to go nuclear.
But that's why right now is so absolutely crucial. There's a window of opportunity. It won't last long, quite clearly, because of Obama's re-election, because of the real troubles, which I think Douglas is right about, within Iran itself. And it's a country deeply divided. Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader are at odds, without any doubt at all. And all that means there is a chance in the next probably 6 months to try to get negotiations going and to begin on confidence.
If Romney had been re-elected, I'm sure that he would have supported an Israeli strike. I think we have a window which no one is taking.
But it's they may be taking.
Let's hope. Let's try and persuade them.
Douglas Murray, you've been in Pyongyang not so long ago. We've just been talking about proliferation. Before we return to the Middle East, I just want to put it in context for the rest of the world, because in a week's time, it's possible that North Korea is going to test its latest missile. And proliferation is not just about the Middle East, of course. It's there are worrying signs in South America and, of course, Asia itself.
Yes, I mean, there are all sorts of lessons which rogue regimes take from regimes which both pursue nuclear weaponry and those that give it up somewhere along the route. And if you just take one example, which has been sort of skipped over, I find, in Britain and various NATO countries, take the example of Gaddafi. Gaddafi volunteered up his nuclear program after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, volunteered it up to the British and Americans, and that attempt he had made was much more advanced than most people outside realised. Now, fast forward nearly a decade.
So he ends up dead.
Exactly. Fast forward a decade.
And he would have been
Gaddafi
alive
has
if he had a bomb.
Gaddafi has internal problems and starts massacring people. But the international community steps in. NATO steps in. Gaddafi is dead.
NATO would not have dared step in. If he had a mass missile, he would have loosed on Brussels.
Exactly. So, if you are the Kim dynasty in North Korea, if you are any other regime which is either near nuclear capability or has just trodden somewhere over it, then you take the lesson that you must never give up nuclear capability. You must never give up the search. It is the only way you will cling on forever.
So, David, let's turn to the country you mentioned just now, Pakistan, and its sort of crucial role in all of this, particularly the network of Dr. Khan.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the precedent I wanted to talk about, the Iranians have looked at Pakistan. Now, from an Iranian point of view, they believe that they reached out to the USA and helped them during 2001 invasion of Afghanistan. Yeah. And then this is from an Iranian point of view. And what did they get in return? Being called a member of the Axis of Evil 2 years later in 2003. Now, America invaded Afghanistan to take out, the country that was harbouring and funding the Taliban. But Pakistan also harboured and funded the Taliban. Instead, Colin Powell called Pakistan a major ally on the war on terror, and went and militarily defeated Afghanistan. So many in Iran have taken this, that the US treats nuclear states differently, and this is very, very worrying. And obviously, as you mentioned, Iran has long-standing illicit nuclear ties with Pakistan in the form of the AQ Khan network, which, as Geoffrey pointed out earlier, in the mid-80s, the enrichment program that is the centre of today's concerns comes from AQ Khan.
Geoffrey Robertson, for those people listening who don't know or have forgotten about AQ Khan, just give us a pencil portrait of the gentleman.
AQ Khan was a metallurgist. You don't need to be Robert Oppenheimer these days to build a bomb. He was a humble metallurgist working in Europe. Bhutto said, Pakistanis will starve in order to get the bomb. AQ Khan said to Bhutto, I'm your man. He stole from Urenco, a European operation, their centrifuge designs, their blueprints for a bomb. He took them back to Pakistan. Of course, Bhutto went, but a series of military leaders encouraged him, and he became a national hero by building Pakistan's bomb. And in India, Pakistan, North Korea, of course, it is a heroic thing to build your nation's bomb. But secretly, he was running a nuclear Walmart. He was prepared to sell nuclear weapons design to anyone. Two of his men even met Al-Qaeda, which is pretty chilling. But he sold them to Syria. You can imagine Assad now with the bomb. He sold them to Gaddafi until Gaddafi, when he came across to the West, exposed AQ Khan. But there he is, sitting under, at first he was put under house or mansion arrest, I suppose. He's now a national hero who started a new political party. In my view, it shows the failure of international criminal law. If there's anyone who deserves to be in prison for life, it's AQ Khan, the merchant of death.
Douglas Murray.
If anyone listening hasn't heard of AQ Khan, it's perfectly understandable, but your children will hear about him. He will become known in history as the person who I think is most responsible for proliferation across the region and the world.
Well,
Shirley Williams.
AQ Khan was terrible, and I don't disagree with that. But I don't think that believing that getting rid of the NPT would in any way help. The only chance we have of a world which begins to get control of nuclear weapons is by way of international. I agree about international law. What I'm doubtful about with Geoffrey's proposal is that it's short-term purpose.
Shirley, you've just mentioned NPT. We should again explain NPT, Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, about the only thing that the world has got at the moment, which is supposed to stop this terrible problem spreading and spreading.
And I just wanted to say that I think it has been more successful than most, not completely successful, of course not, but it's more successful than some, at least, of our interlocutors in this table suggest, because the fact that Iran is still a member of NPT is one of the reasons why I think it is not about to pass the threshold.
So states have a choice of being part of this, which means nuclear inspections.
It means a huge number of inspections. In the case of Iran, a huge number of inspections.
I'm sorry, Shirley, Iran just refuses to allow the inspectors into Parchin. It's believed that Parchin is, and they have a lot of information that Parchin military base in Iran.
They have just said that there will be an inspection of Parchin. It's a military base. But let me just finish my argument for a minute.
Can I just before you do that, Shirley, to explain to people, if you don't join the NPT, if you say I don't want any part of this,
right,
what then happens? What's the sanctions?
Well, up until the, I think, disgraceful agreement between the Bush administration and India, there was a quite powerful control through the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which meant that they would not pass on material and weapons, instruments that could make weapons. That was broken by George Bush. I think it was a dangerously irresponsible thing to do, and he agreed to allow India to breach the NSG. So the real problem with the NPT at the moment is not that it doesn't exist, it's not that it doesn't inspect, it's not that it hasn't got some very excellent inspection teams. It is that there are 3 countries outside it.
4.
4 if you include North Korea. The 3 countries outside it are India, Pakistan and Israel. And I agree with Geoffrey, there's a real element of hypocrisy in all 3 countries in their attempts to suggest that somehow they're on the right side of the nuclear issue. If you get rid of the NPT, as distinct from trying to improve it, what you will do is considerably worsen the position. The world is full of potential AQ Khans. So far, they have not got very far because they have mostly been stopped before they could get anywhere. But if you get rid of that structure, God help us, because we then are in a world of anarchy, and I think that would be insupportable.
And is this the answer, Douglas Murray, to the a lot of people? We've experienced 60 years of, as it were, nuclear balance and MAD, and there hasn't been a nuclear war. And there is I think among a lot of people there's a general feeling that nuclear weapons have kept the peace and that we can therefore somehow relax about this.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think there's a degree of relaxedness about it, and indeed about a lot of this conversation, which is very troubling. I mean, most people's paradigm of this is the Cold War, is a standoff between the West and the Soviet Union, is the idea that rational actors were aware that at the ultimate resort it would be annihilation on all sides, and it wouldn't be worth it. If you take even of the countries that have just been mentioned, leave North Korea out for a second, you take Israel, and Pakistan and India. These 3 countries have, I would argue, a situation which is not too dissimilar from that. Between India and Pakistan, you have a form of standoff. Both countries feel themselves that they need to be nuclear armed in order to prevent the other's aggression and so on. This is, to an extent, you could see India and Pakistan as a standoff of a Cold War kind. In the case of Israel, why does Israel seek to have nuclear power? Because every few years, until it was a nuclear power, its neighbours en masse went over its borders, invaded and tried to eradicate the whole state. Now, you could argue that since Israel has been nuclear, its neighbours haven't tried to do that. They've tried to do it in unconventional ways, but not in the conventional way of rolling tanks all over, because they knew that could be endgame. So for Israel, this is a deterrent of that kind. The problem you get once you get towards Iran going nuclear and everyone else in the region going nuclear is that with all of the animosities travelling in every single direction, everybody has nuclear weaponry pointed not in one direction, but in every direction. What you have then is what I would describe as a Mexican standoff.
There are too many tripwires in too many directions.
Where by the time the shooting has finished, nobody knows or is around to know who started it.
We're in a different era. I mean, we think 65 years have gone since Nagasaki. It induces complacency. But most of that time was a Cold War era where the leaders were sane. They had children. They had retirement plans. They didn't want to destroy each other. Now we're in an era of proliferation. Pakistan has estimated 110 nukes. In August, there was an Islamic terrorist attack on the Minhas Air Force Base where some of them are stored. They didn't get them, but one day they will. India has about 100. As I've said, Israel 80 to 200. None of those are members of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and North Korea has about 12. North Korea broke the NPT. It left it in 2003 and started testing nuclear weapons, and it is now aiming for a ballistic rocket. It's testing it later this week, which will go up in the atmosphere and come down. It could come down in California. If they work out how to ensure that a nuclear warhead doesn't burn up on re-entry, they'll be able to nuke America in a few years. So we're in a completely different era, and we have no law. We have a law against dum-dum bullets. We have a law against poison arrows and landmines, but we have no law that incriminates the possession or even the use of nuclear weapons.
Except genocide.
I want to come on to the what is to be done question in a moment. Just before I do, David Patrick Aragos, what about the NPT finally? Why was it that Iran, despite all the inspections, someone decided to join that?
Well, the decision was taken under the Shah of Iran, and as I said previously, he was very keen to be like the West, like its Western role models, and very keen to sign up to whatever they wanted him to sign up to.
But the mullahs never pulled out.
No, they never
considered. Why do you think that was?
Because I think to pull out of the NPT, they would truly become even more of a pariah than they are. And you have to understand, Iran is a lot of things, but North Korea it ain't. It doesn't like isolation. It believes it's a country with a great history. I mean, it wants more engagement, not less. That's the problem with Iran. It wants to meddle in its region. It wants hegemony. It's not North Korea. It doesn't want to pull up the shutters.
Well, it sees itself as a historic great power in the region.
And it acts like one in the region. It believes it's a country of 70 million people. I mean, it controls the Straits of Hormuz, where a lot of the world's oil supply flows through. It wants more engagement. The type of engagement it wants is a problem. But it's not North Korea, and that's why I don't think, unless it's bombed, Iran will ever leave the NPT.
So, before we start the more general conversation about what's to be done, what's your view on how the West should now be treating Iran?
Look, it was said before and it was correct. There is a window of opportunity now. The sanctions are really hurting Iran. You know, the rial is plummeting. Food inflation is up 50%. About 5-6 years ago, Ahmadinejad could employ what I could term nuclear populism. He could whip up sentiment in Iran saying, look, the West, they want to deny us nuclear power and the best traditions of imperialism. Now people, they care less about centrifuges or enriching uranium than they do about jobs. They want jobs.
And chicken. They can't
afford the cliche, can't afford chicken and rice.
Yeah.
So we have a real opportunity here. I think, I'm against military action because I don't think it would work. I just think practically it's wrong. I think diplomacy is the only way to go. History shows that Iran compromises when it's weak. It last suspended uranium enrichment in 2003 after it just watched America take out Iraq very efficiently. This was before the disaster of the peace. And I spoke to diplomats who spoke to the Iranians, and the Iranians were scared and they suspended. They're under huge pressure now. History shows that Iran compromises when it feels weak. Let's hope that something can happen, because otherwise I think we're in big trouble.
I don't think sanctions will work. They will. Wait a minute. They worked. They will damage the middle class that are opposed to the mullahs, and in a way they put backs up. If I'm opposed to an attack on by Israel simply because it's wrong, it's illegal, and so I would hope, although I fear that Israel will bomb next year, I think that would be counterproductive in every which way.
Shirley Williams and then Douglas Murray.
Very briefly, I think that it's quite clear, as David said, that sanctions are working on Iran, that there has been a 2/3 fall in the rial, the currency, that there are really serious issues now about people keeping alive, and there's an election coming up next year, not with Ahmadinejad, his time is gone, but an election for a new president, and it's highly unlikely that the situation with sanctions would not have huge political repercussions. It's already having them.
Douglas Murray.
If I could just come on this issue of the window of opportunity. The window of opportunity, I agree, is there, and it's been massively lengthened in recent months and indeed years. I've, for about 6-7 maybe more years now, had the conversation of when a strike was going to happen by international forces or Israel or America and so on. The reason why nothing has happened is because something which should be mentioned. There have been massive behind-the-scenes efforts, not only to do with sanctions, but massive behind-the-scenes efforts that have very successfully helped delay Iran's project. Two are worth flagging up in particular. The first is the deployment of computer viruses. Everyone's heard about Stuxnet virus and so on. These are extremely intelligent ways to delay the Iranian nuclear program. The second, and undoubtedly far more controversial, is the issue of nuclear scientists in Iran, as it were,
being assassinated,
dying before their time in the middle of rush hour traffic. Now, I have to say, nobody knows who is responsible for this. It could be any number of actors in the region.
People tend to
assume people tend to assume that it's Israel,
UK.
but there are a large number of actors in the region who would have an interest in delaying.
But do you think that's actually slowed the programme down? I think it sends a message, but I don't think the odd nuclear scientist assassinated slowed down. Stuxnet certainly did, but the assassination's not so sure.
But the combination of these two things, I agree, Stuxnet is certainly undoubtedly more effective in slowing down. But the combination of these two things does something, which means that the window we are talking about has continually been lengthened.
But assassination is outrageous.
I absolutely agree.
And I mean, Israel talks of a surgical strike on Iran, but the problem is there are 5,000 people working at Natanz.
Yes.
Any strike will kill them. There are 370 tons of uranium hexafluoride in the Iranian facilities. Once you bomb those and the cloud moves in the right direction, you're killing thousands.
Just before Douglas responds to that, we should explain that you've actually been involved and you've watched some of the wargaming, as it were, about what might happen if there was an Israeli strike. Right?
No, I can't say I've been involved.
I'm sorry, I've got that wrong. I'm sorry, that was David. I beg your pardon. David's been...
I've seen some of the projections, as it were, of it, but I don't want
to... Same question to David.
Yes. Well, I was in Israel recently and I watched them wargame an attack on Iran. I mean, as you know, war game is where everybody plays the parts of different actors. So there are people playing Hezbollah, people playing Iran, people playing America, people playing Israel, and it worked out quite well for Israel in the Israeli war game that I watched. I'm
somewhat.
See
the Iranian war game?
No, alas, no, they didn't let us in. But I'm not so sure it would go quite so well for Israel as it did in the war game.
Allow me I'm certainly wouldn't be one of those. I don't think there's anyone who thinks that any strike by anyone on Iran as the last resort would be anything but extremely messy, both regionally and locally and everything else. But I just raise this issue because the date of the strike, everybody for years has kept on saying, nearly a decade now, has been saying, within the next 6 months, the window of opportunity. My point is the window of opportunity has kept on being lengthened. And there is a reason for this, because neither America under Bush or under Obama, not Israel under any of its leadership, wants this as a preference. Nobody is for a strike. But there are some people, and I would include myself among one of them, who believe that if at the very, very last resort it was perfectly clear that Iran was intending to go nuclear, and after that point the mullahs would be entrenched forever, then it may be necessary to make a strike. Whoever would be involved. That might be Israel, it might be America and Israel, it might be some other forces. But that as an ultimate resort, action should be on the table.
Shirley Williams.
2 points right away. The first is that Douglas is quite right about tremendous efforts made, mostly by the Obama administration, to try to stop any kind of strike. I don't think he's quite right in assuming that degree of restraint in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu has used some very, very militant language indeed, and he sees his own electoral prospects.
They haven't started a war, though. Actually,
well, he hasn't had the chance to. Can I may I finish?
Yes,
you guys have all had a go. Come on. Its electoral prospects turn to some extent on being seen as taking a very militant attitude towards the Arab world and also towards Iran, which is not, of course, the Arab world. That's very important. He's going to use that kind of rhetoric. I think he was stopped by Obama and to some extent, lesser extent, by the Europeans, thank God. I also think that we are not facing up in this conversation to the fantastic consequences we might get. For example, Iran has got major control over the state of Hormuz, the Gulf of Hormuz. It is capable of...
Through which the oil comes.
Through which the oil comes, and at the moment we still need oil, maybe not in the future, but we do now. We're likely to tip the whole world into a second recession very, very quickly, and that's going to be a recession that lasts for a very long time. And not least, I think we don't recognise the extent to which Iran is a state much respected by the Shia element in the Arab world. And that means that all through the Middle East there will be acts of terrorism and acts of barbarism and so forth in order to stop this coming about. The consequences are so grave that we really have to stick with trying to get diplomacy to work.
Douglas Murray.
The consequences are all grey. However, the blackest of all is a nuclear set of weaponry in Tehran under the control of the mullahs. Very quickly, on the Straits of Hormuz, you hear this a lot, so it's just worth mentioning. If the Iranian government closed the Straits of Hormuz, the Iranian fleet would find itself on the bottom of the floor of the ocean the day after.
But Douglas, you've left out completely the fact that security people in Israel and in America all agree that it would be most unwise and foolish
If
to
I may
have a
say so,
strike.
Shirley, you do listen to the Israeli and American officials that you want to. There are
Do you
many
want to hear
different...
Benny Glantz?
I knew you
The
were going to
former
mention
head of
Benny Glantz.
Mossad?
I knew
All right,
you were going to
well,
mention
it's
Benny Glantz.
actually-
But
it's
my
that
simple
long.
point would be, Shirley, that there are many other people in Washington and in Israel who think differently from
Striking
you.
Iran is worse than
I've-
Iran getting the bomb.
Yes, I'm the peacemaker around the table. I've got nothing more than conventional vocal weapons here. Geoffrey Robertson, I wanted to move on to the central proposition in your book, because we haven't really mentioned it yet, which is you argue that it's absurd that international humanitarian law does not include an attempt to ban the possession of nuclear weapons.
I do.
And that is one of the areas to which the world should now be looking, to which an awful lot of people would say, yeah, but come on. I mean, trying to change the law internationally isn't going to affect the big nuclear powers in practical terms.
Well,
What's
we've
it
got to
going
make
do?
a start. And we're a world in which international humanitarian law bans dum-dum bullets and landmines, and which says that weapons are illegal if they cause unnecessary suffering, if they can't distinguish between civilian and soldier, between military installations and hospitals. So we've got to face up to nuclear weapons, where if any weapon is illegal, it must be this weapon that can wipe the world out. So
And there have been attempts to raise this issue
Yes,
in international
They
court.
have, and because of America, basically, and Israel, they were not incriminated when the Rome Conference of the International Criminal Court came down in 1998. I happen to know that in 2016, most of the, as it were, decent countries of the world, led by Mexico, Japan and Australia, will be seeking to put the nuclear weapons in the category of weapons that are banned per se. It will be a crime against humanity to use them. Unfortunately, there was a World Court case in 1996 where Britain argued that it was perfectly legal to use nuclear weapons because they could be used on ships at sea or on troops in deserts. They entirely forgot the fact that the wind blows the ionizing radiation. That was John Major's government. And whether our government in 2016, whichever it is, will take that view remains to be seen. But I think, international law cannot disarm. That's for sure. But it can and must, I think, have some sort of framework, or at least envisage a framework, whereby all those powers that currently possess nuclear weapons become bound by the obligation in the NPT, in Article 6 of the NPT, to negotiate in good faith for ultimate disarmament, and then we ban the acquisition of new weapons, and it is possible then for the Security Council or for a coalition of the willing to act against those states that are seeking to acquire nuclear weapons when they get to the stage of having the bomb.
David, from an Iranian perspective, or looking at it through the spectacles of Iran, what do you think would be the result of a new international drive to make nuclear weapons illegal?
Well, I suspect the Iranians would pay lip service to it, but probably could continue on much as they are, I have to say. I think I would say I think it's premature to say that the NPT is dead. I mean, since it came into force in 1970, only North Korea has proliferated, and because it introduced a set of values, actually, that if you did want to proliferate, you put yourself in the North Korea camp, i.e. a rogue state. I will say, however, if Iran goes nuclear, then it's finished. I agree 100%.
Douglas Murray and then Shirley Williams.
I like the idea because anything that gives off a signal, as it were, that this is intolerable, I think is a good thing. But, the old cliche is that the people in the army, generals, think that force is the answer to everything. In my experience, that's not true at all. But that's an old idea. It tends to be the case that diplomats think that diplomacy is the only answer, and politicians think that you need more politicians. And in my experience, lawyers do think that the answer to everything has an answer in law. And although I wish it were the case,
like Lord Justice Leveson by suggesting
it is certainly an aspect of it which I think is very important.
Shirley Williams.
I was a member of the Japan-Australian International Commission, which indeed came up with this idea, and I think very sensibly so. And I agree with Geoffrey that I think it's very wise and sensible to look at nuclear weapons as a weapon of mass destruction and therefore close to a humanity-threatening weapon. But there's two problems. The first is that at the moment there would undoubtedly be at the United Nations Security Council vetoes cast by the United States, probably, and by Russia and China very probably too. So it's a long-term proposal. I think it's a long-term proposal. It has a great deal to be said for it and growing support for it. But I think the problem is the immediate short-term, and that's where I think the window of opportunity is the only chance we have to deal with Iran in the next few months.
And you were talking about a new diplomatic initiative and even tougher sanctions.
Well, even tougher. The two will go side by side, obviously. I don't think we need tougher sanctions right now. We need to run into this diplomatic period, and we need to look at confidence building and possibly even at the extent of so-called negative security assurances. I think one of the key things about Iran is that it's scared stiff of all the nuclear-armed countries around it, and if the United States were to extend to some extent its guarantees, that would help a great deal.
In the long term, if we are to eliminate nuclear weapons in our lifetime, or even our children's lifetime, we have to make a start now, and we have to stop this incredible disjunction between disarmament, which is one part of the UN, and human rights. We've got to realise that the bomb is the greatest threat to human rights, the right to life, the right to live free of torture by death by radiation. And we've got to, it's extraordinary, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch don't touch the issue of the bomb. And I think we've got to make it a popular campaign to, on a human rights basis, to end the bomb, or at least to work towards a framework to eliminate the bomb in 2045 or whatever.
David Patrick Karakos, final thought?
A final thought is I agree with Shirley. I think that there is a window of opportunity now to make Iran listen. Whether it will or not is another story, but I think we've got a better chance than we've had in the last 5 or 6 years.
And a final thought from Douglas Murray.
Yes, the window of opportunity should be one which we hope, at the end of which the mullahs are no longer in power. I mean, that is the real hope at the end of all this, that Iran can return to being a normal, decent country. It deserves a place in the region, it deserves a place in the world, but that place cannot be held as long as the mullahs are in charge.
A state that terrorises its own people.
Absolutely.
Well, unfortunately, regime change is the hardest thing to get.
And on that sobering note, we haven't even got round to China, but thank you all very much indeed, Shirley Williams and Douglas Murray, Geoffrey Robertson's Mullahs Without Mercy, and David Patrick Karakos's Nuclear Iran, The Birth of an Atomic State, are both out now. Next week, we unfurl the saltire, because we're going to be discussing Scotland with Ian Rankin, Alistair Gray and Joyce Macmillan, and we will be in the Royal Opera House the week after that, talking about the future of The Voice. That's on the 11th of December at 2 o'clock. And if you'd like to come along as we explore that, there are apparently some tickets available. You go to the BBC homepage and look for tickets. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There are many more Radio 4 arts and discussion programmes to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.
Murray, and by David Patrick Karakos, who's written a detailed history of the bomb and Iran. And David, let's just start with you, because I think a lot of people will be surprised just how early the story of Iran's nuclear program starts.
I think you're right. I mean, it actually starts in the 1950s. So we're talking about a program that is over 60 years old now. It has deep roots in Iranian history under the last ruling regime of Iran, the Shah of Iran, the King of Iran, who desired nuclear power because he thought it would make his country very Western and very modern. He saw that his role models were Britain, his role models America and France, all the Western powers were nuclear powers. And he thought this was the way that Iran would become modern, and this is how he would regain imperial glory, if you like.
And this is after a long period when Iran had basically been carved up or dominated by Britain and by Russia, and increasingly in this period by America. And
the Germans and the French were building the nuclear facilities in Iran. Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini came during the Islamic Revolution and decided there would be no, as he called it, Westoxification in Iran. This was the sullying of pure Islam by Western influence. So the nuclear program was seen as a Trojan horse for Western influence. It was seen to be in the hands of vicious foreigners, quote unquote. So it was actually scrapped initially.
Geoffrey Robinson, your book, Mullahs Without Mercy, covers some of this area too.
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that the position turned when Saddam started to use chemical weapons during in the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq war, and the West just turned a blind eye to it. He killed tens of thousands of young Iranians on the battlefield, and Iran then felt, well, the only way we can beat him is by going nuclear, and that is what the Revolutionary Guards advised. And Khomeini, who had initially said nuclear weapons are un-Islamic, we won't have them, they're a Western-designed weapon, changed his mind because he got the advice that they could win the war with Saddam only if they had nuclear weapons. And from 1986, when they invited A.Q. Khan to Iran for the first time, and he was the Mr. Nuclear Weapons, and they paid him millions in the 90s. So that there is no doubt that from that point they have sought for their own security nuclear weapons.
Well, we're going to be talking about, I'm sure, the sinister Dr. Khan at some greater length later on. Shirley Williams, though, just coming.
Well, I'm glad Geoffrey said what he did, because there's a sense in which Iran is, I think, much more of a victim power than we tend to see it as being in the West. It's easy to forget that in the Iran-Iraq war, where, incidentally, there were strong arms supplies.
In fact, the Americans are the first people to hand over plutonium to Tehran.
They are indeed. I mean, the nuclear program started with a bilateral agreement in 1957 between the Iranians and the Americans that gave the Iranians their first nuclear reactor, a small research reactor in Tehran. I would say, though, that from the very beginning, despite having been instrumental in giving nuclear power to Iran, America has been very, very robust on proliferation with Iran. Even when they were big allies in the 1970s, the Shah and various presidents, President Nixon, President Carter, they were adamant that Iran should not proliferate. So they have been consistent on this.
So what happened after the fall of the Shah? You have the regime of Khomeini, you have the Islamic Republic, and the first period of that is kind of pretty robustly against nuclear weapons, isn't it?
Well, that's the very interesting thing. The Shah saw a nuclear program as a very Western thing. So what he did is he dealt with Western powers.
Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. Well, this week, as most weeks, if you turn from the domestic news pages to the foreign ones, you'll find violence and anger in the Middle East dominating page after page. Today, Israel retaliating for UN moves on recognising a Palestinian state, more awful violence in Syria, political confrontation in Egypt. So what would it be like if the entire region was also nuclear armed? Israel's got nuclear weapons and Iran is now on the very edge of getting them. I'm joined today by the human rights lawyer Geoffrey Robertson, who wants nuclear weaponry to be opposed by international law, by the veteran Liberal Democrat anti-nuclear campaigner Shirley Williams, by the neoconservative writer Douglas